right, guys, we're on lesson 4.
Yeah.
I know we've covered some pretty intense things, but and we talked about idolatry in the last lesson as far as all of humanity goes. It's when humanity says to God, hey, God, I know what's important for my life, right?
Yeah.
Don't need you. And so what results is building of the images and the statues and the altars in some nations, other nations. The whole root of it is that they think up foolish ideas of what God is like. And now, how does this address Christians? This is what we need to talk about, because I'm going to show you in the next 2 lessons that what Paul is dealing with the Corinthian church is actually idolatry, is the root behind what was making them weak and sick and dying prematurely. And that is our spiritual kryptonite. So, idolatry among the people of the world is bad enough, but finding it among those who have a covenant with God, it's dreadful. All right? For the believer, idolatry is to commit adultery against God. Okay? So idolatry is kryptonite. And I want you to think of something. Okay? Remember how James says you're adulteresses? You can't commit adultery with someone you don't have a covenant with. So that's another fact that shows that James is only talking to believers. When he says you make yourself an enemy of God. And he says that twice, by the way. He says you've made yourself an enemy of God twice, meaning there's emphasis. That's the way Hebrews, when they wrote, they would emphasize is write something twice. We use exclamation points or italicize or bold-faced words, right? They would just write it twice. He said, I say it again, because he's saying, get this. So the thing is, I'm married to Lisa Bevere, right? The only person I could commit adultery against is Lisa Bevere. I can't commit adultery against Jane Smith. I don't have a covenant of marriage with Jane Smith. Now, I can commit adultery with Jane Smith, but not against Jane Smith. James says, you have committed adultery against God, okay, in speaking to the Christians, okay? So, in order to introduce this, we're going to go back and look at the life of Saul, all right, how idolatry manifests in a believer. If you remember, Saul became king, and God gave him a very specific word through the prophet. What was the specific word? I want you to utterly destroy all the Amalekites. Every man, woman, child, every one of their sheep, every one of their oxen, everything, right? He goes, he gets the army. He goes and kills every man, woman, and child, except he saves the king alive. He destroys all the animals except for the very best to give the people to offer as a sacrifice to the Lord. Something that was prescribed by Moses, right? So now Saul comes back, they're offering the sheep and all that. And here comes the prophet Samuel, and the prophet Samuel says, you have disobeyed, actually says, you have rebelled against God. Now let's stop and think about this. Let's say there was 100,000 Amalekites. He has killed 99,999 of them, right? He saved one guy alive. He's done 99% of what he was told to do. Plus, right? I remember this time when this father was looking at me and he was saying, man, I'm having a lot of trouble with my son. And I said, why? He said, my son gets so upset at me for looking at the things that he doesn't do. He said, my son said to me, Dad, I've done 90% of what you asked. Why are you so upset that I went out and played with my friends before I did the other part? He said, why don't you look at the good I've done, Dad? And I said to that dad that was frustrated, I said, well, then God looks at the small percentage that Saul doesn't do, because God is the one that says that Saul has rebelled against me. And yet Saul did 99% of what he was told to do. So the prophet, backs Saul into the corner, and Saul first tries to put the blame on the people, then he tries to make excuses and all this stuff, and finally Samuel backs him into the corner, and he says this, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. So Saul, King Saul, rejected the word of the Lord that was given to him, right? That's what he said. He's rebelled, right? Now, I want you to look at this statement. Stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Can we just isolate that for a minute here? Look at this now. Stubbornness is as idolatry. Do you notice the word is and as are in italic type? Do you want to know why that is? Because it's not in the original translation. The translators added the word is and as. If you really want to know what would have been a better translation, it should have read this. Stubbornness is idolatry. Now, the word stubbornness is this. It means this. It means to push back. all right? When the truth is known and yet we push back and don't obey God, that's idolatry. Our will, our agenda, what we desire have been placed above what God desires. Why did Saul do this? Have you ever thought about it? Because back then, if you capture a king of a nation and you bring him into your palace, he's a living trophy. Every time you look at that king, it reminds you of how you defeated his entire nation. Why does he give the best sheep to the people? Because he wants to be a popular king. The approval rating will go up. Okay? So he put that above what God said. All right? Are you seeing this? So in the previous lesson that we talked about, okay, the same is true. Remember, the root of the people was that they wanted to do what they thought was best for them. Saul did the same thing. So this core behavior leads us to exchanging the truth for a lie. Okay? Deception now begins to set in. Remember, Saul says, I did obey, I did obey, I did obey. And finally, Samuel has to just back him into the corner, right? So foolish thinking proceeds now and doing things that should not be done. If you look at Saul's life, he becomes extremely angry. He's jealous. He's trying to kill one of his servants named David, right? He's throwing spears at him. He's acting like a madman, right? He even goes to a witch for direction. He uses an entire army to chase after one young man, and he thinks he's doing the right thing. Are you seeing what I'm saying? The deception that comes in, often those who have a relationship with God and yet choose their own desires over what he clearly reveals through his word, the scripture, become blind to their own disobedience. That's why stubbornness, pushing back from obeying God, is idolatry. We put our desires, our wishes, above what God clearly states in his word. To introduce the next aspect of idolatry, I want to introduce two words. First word I want to talk about is contentment, all right? The word contentment, if I define it from the English dictionary, a feeling or showing satisfaction with one's possession, status, or situation. That's Merriam-Webster, okay? If you look at the Greek word, it means to suffice, to be sufficient, satisfy, and by implication, to be strong and able to assist someone. Now, I want you to focus in on the last part of that. To be strong and able to assist someone. We cannot properly serve, okay, as believers in Jesus Christ, we can't properly serve unless we're content. Why? Because if we lack contentment, we're always going to be serving with the angle of what's in this for me. How am I going to benefit from this? All right? That's why Paul says in Philippians 4:11, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned that whatever state I am in, to be content. Paul was a servant. He could be a perfect servant because why? He didn't have the next word that I'm going to talk to you about. And let me read to you 1 Timothy 6 before I go to that next word. Now, godliness with contentment is great gain. You always have to remember, you're content when you know that God is the one that supplies your needs. Now, that supplying may not come in your timetable, but it's never, ever going to be late. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. Notice Paul is focusing in contentment. I was in prayer one day and I said, God, tell me what your definition of contentment is. And he said, to be content is to be completely satisfied in my will. Okay? Jesus' life is a picture of contentment. Okay? But if you look at it, I mean, this was, if you even look at the first temptation in the wilderness, it was Jesus, satisfy what you need outside of God's provision. But yet, as soon as he resisted, God sent the angels and brought great provision. They fed him with manna, heaven's bread, right? If you look at that, I don't know if it was manna, but they fed him, right? I don't want you to confuse the word contentment with complacency. Jesus certainly wasn't complacent. I mean, you see him turn over the money changer's table. You see him look at his disciples and say, with great passionate desire, I couldn't wait to eat this meal with you. You look at the fact that he would, just be so dissatisfied with seeing people sick and hurting, right? So contentment doesn't mean complacent. It means you're satisfied in the will of God. Now, the opposing word I want to introduce next to contentment is the word covetous. Now, covetousness, covet, is not a word that we use today. And that's why I'm taking great strides to introduce this word. You don't hear people saying, hey, you covetous? No, I'm not me, man. I'm not covetous. So we don't talk about covetousness today, all right? So let's define it. The English definition from Merriam-Webster's is a strong desire of obtaining and possessing some supposed good, okay? I'm going to open up with Colossians chapter 1, and I'm going to look at, or chapter 3, I'm going to look at the very first verse, okay? If you then were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth. You do this, and you're going to avoid the word I'm about to introduce, and that's called covetousness. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. So to seek those things are above and to set your affections there is the key to staying content. All right? But now if you look at what Paul says in the very next verse, he says in verse 5 and 6, therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desires, and covetousness. Everybody say covetousness.
Covetousness.
All right, now watch this, which is idolatry. So right there, Paul identifies what idolatry is.
Yeah.
Covetousness is idolatry. Okay? Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience. So when we move out of contentment into a state of being covetous, we have moved from a relationship of intimacy with God into the altars of idolatry or adultery. Okay? If you look at the Greek word for that word covetous in Colossians, it is an inappropriate desire for more. But the CCE, which is the commentary, critical, and explanatory of the whole Bible, wow, that's a mouthful. I love this. It implies a self-idolizing, grasping spirit. All right? So contentment moves us away from idolatry, right? And it moves us closer to the heart of God. But covetousness, it drives us to the altars of idolatry, away from the heart of God. This is why the writer of Hebrews makes this statement. Let your conduct, let your behavior be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? So a Christian engages in idolatry when he or she disregards what God has clearly revealed in order to obtain a strong desire. Are you seeing this?
Yeah. Wow.
So idolatry is known disobedience to the will of God.
Wow.
It's not when a believer falls into sin. It's when a believer is given over to sin. I need to say that again. It's not when a believer falls into sin. It's when a believer is given over to sin. Okay? If you ponder about everything that we've talked about, you'll see that this covetousness describes everything I've talked about. If you look at Achan, remember Achan? When I saw among the spoils, I coveted them. He said, I took them. I've actually got the scripture. Look at this. This is from a different translation. When I saw among the spoils, I coveted them and I took them. Wow. The NLT says, I wanted them so much. All right? If you look at the Corinthian church, Paul said to them, you're still controlled by your sinful desires. They're jealous. They're divided. They're picking favorite preachers. They're committing adultery. They are suing one another. I mean, they're divisive. They're in strife with one another. If you look at James, James described the same things that Paul was addressing with the Corinthians. He said, you guys have bitter jealousy. He said, you're motivated by selfish ambition. He said, you're quarreling and you're fighting. These are all results of idolatry. Okay? Listen to what James says in James chapter 4, verse 2. Look at this. I'm going to put it up on the board. You covet and you cannot obtain. That's when he goes on to say, you're adulteresses. So you see, all of this idolatry, we're all thinking statues, right?
Yeah.
Images, right? Whenever you read about idolatry in the Old Testament, just put in place of the statue what's behind it. Known disobedience to the will of God. That's what true idolatry is. Are you seeing this?
Yeah.
Okay, so idolatry is not merely sin. It's intentional or known sin, and this is our kryptonite, okay? If you look at Adam and Eve, it's how it all started. Eve saw something good in that tree that God clearly said, stay away from. Okay, so she now moved into the position of saying, I know what's best for me, more than what God has said. Once we've chosen this course of action, deception sets in. Okay, remember Romans chapter 1? They suppress the truth, and deception takes over, correct? Yeah. Consequently, we begin to think up foolish ideas of what God's like, right? We exchange the truth for a lie. So it's no different for a believer. This is why James says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only. Look at this. Deceiving yourself. What could be worse? Why do you think the first words out of Jesus' mouth when they are asking about what's it going to be like before he returns? Be very careful that you're not deceived. That's the first words. Why? Because people in the last days, we're going to figure out how to serve God but still get our covetous desires. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is what we're continuing here. We're leading into this, all right? Are you getting this? Yeah. All right, now, the word deceived from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is to cause to accept as true or valid what is false or invalid. Remember, we suppress the truth with a lie. We embrace the lie as good, and now we say what is truly good to be evil. We can't just pick out the scriptures we like and ignore the other scriptures we don't like. We have to embrace the whole counsel of God in the New Testament, correct? Yeah. He said, because James said, for you, if you listen to the word and don't obey, it's like glancing at your face in the mirror. You see yourself and you walk away and you forget what you look like. Why do we see people who can come to services, come to conferences today, sing the worship songs, love while the word's being preached, but yet when they walk out, they act just like the world? They're in division. They're in strife. They're committing fornication. They're doing all these things that the New Testament clearly teaches us not to do. They forgot what manner of person they are. They forgot they have the nature of Jesus Christ in them. See, when I was a sinner, I didn't have the nature of God. I sinned. That's what my nature was to do. But when I become a believer, my whole nature has changed. I become a brand new creation. Now when I sin, I'm going against my nature. Do you see what I'm saying? All right, now, so in embracing kryptonite, what we've done is we've given up our vigor. We've given up our vitality. We've given up our otherworldly powers. We've given up our ability to change our world. If you look at Paul, he finally cries out to the Corinthian church, awake to righteousness and do not sin, for some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your same. Do you know what Paul is saying to these guys? There are so many people in the city of Corinth that don't know, they don't have the knowledge of God. They don't know Jesus. You are the only Jesus they are going to see. But you've embraced this kryptonite. You don't have the otherworldly powers. You're not living above them, so now they don't see the real Jesus. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what's going on? So, if you remember, I'm going to bring these scriptures back to your remembrance. In lesson 1, I brought them up. Peter said, stand up. I myself am a man. He has to tell a Roman officer, quit worshiping me. I'm not a god. Paul has to say, what do you think you're doing? We're not gods. To all the people in Lystra. If you look at the citizens of Malta, they jumped to the conclusion he was a god. Wow. If you look at the citizens of Thessalonica, they said, these are the people that have turned the world upside down. Listen to me carefully. These reports were lacking about the Corinth church. Wow. If you go back and look, now you got to remember, all these things that I've put up here, this happened right after Jesus was raised from the dead. Okay? Paul is writing to the Corinth church about 30 years later. If you look at church history and you look at the Corinth church, they did not affect. Remember how the early church, the entire city of Lydda got saved? The entire city of Joppa, the city of Samaria. If you look at the region of Asia, that's not happening in Corinth. Why? Because Corinth has embraced spiritual kryptonite. They've lost their otherworldly powers. Are you seeing this? Wow. They're not standing out, and it's not just everybody, it's the some that are causing the effects on the many. So the body of believers in Corinth were ineffective at changing their city. Again, I want to tell you, I go and I preach at churches, and I'm so thankful that there are 10,000 people in the church. But I think, what about the other 3 million people in this city?
Yeah.
Where are they? Why aren't they seeing a living Jesus like the early church? And remember, God says, before Jesus returns, everything's going to be restored, and our glory is going to be so much greater. I believe that if we address this and quit skirting the issue, I believe we're going to be a church that changes cities once again. I believe this with all of my heart. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written this book. And so I've shown how idolatry manifests in stubbornness, in covetousness. But the most deceptive form of idolatry, I'm going to clearly describe in the next lesson. And you don't want to miss it. We'll see you then.
Contentment is complete satisfaction in the will of God. Covetousness is the opposite of that contentment. The more you think of what you're grateful for, the more you'll be content in what God has to offer you. Today, I want to challenge you to make a list of all that you're thankful for. Throughout the week, continue to add to this list, and when you look back at it, thank God from the bottom of your heart. This will help you be content in the good and perfect will of God.